Just really briefly for everyone else on Dom before I let him take it away as well. Dom, so as I mentioned, Dom is co-founder and CTO at Heron Data. Heron Data is a YC company. They're a FinTech software as a service company. Prior to Heron, Dominic was working at Revolut as head of data science and growth analytics. He was also previously a data scientist at Facebook and Spotify and a management consultant, I believe, before that. And Dom studied physics, something completely different, well, somewhat different at Yale. So just generally, he's just a smart guy. And so I'm very excited for this Q&A because I think there's a lot to learn from Dom, both in terms of startup, both in terms of building a technical product from the ground up, as well as about data science and generally making a career switch as well, because Dom did not study computer science as well. Cool. Thanks, Dom.
Yeah.
And so I think the way we can structure this, maybe you can just introduce yourself and describe the company and some of the challenge, maybe a project or some of the challenges you faced. And then we can spend the majority of the session, maybe about the last 45 minutes, doing a Q&A where students can lead and ask the questions they're most passionate about. I'll be moderating the Q&A. There is a Pigeonhole link that I'm going to share again in the Zoom chat. So that's going to be the upvoted and downvoted questions, or upvoted questions that I'll be using to help moderate the Q&A later.
Great,
cool.
Thanks, Kai. That was a very thorough introduction. I'm not sure I can add too much more on the personal side, so I won't go there. But I'll talk a little bit more about Heron Data and what we do and the projects, as you mentioned. So, hi everyone, Dom, co-founder Heron Data. We're an API for fintechs, and the sort of easy way to describe what we do is we clean up bank transactions. And so what happens is people send us messy bank data, and we figure out various things that people want to know about the bank data, like what category does the transaction fall into, who is the merchant, what sort of payment processor is being used, is this a subscription, what is this transaction really? Because sometimes when you look at your bank transactions and you see a charge, you're just like, what is this? I have no idea. And so if it's hard for you knowing what you spend on, it's really hard for companies to also know. And so customers basically use us to do things like make loans to companies or individuals to improve the user experience inside their application and to create features that generally rely on this sort of enrichment. So being like, hey, I want to give my employees a company card, but they're not allowed to spend on gambling or, like entertainment or something. And so we started last year, went through Y Combinator and raised a seed round in sort of a year ago now, and I've been working on it ever since. We're a team of 5. And so the way it's distributed is we have one guy doing sales, one guy doing deployment and sort of customer management, and 3 engineers. So one sort of 2 generalists and 1 more machine learning engineer. But everyone basically wears all sorts of different hats at different times, and that's just the nature of working in an early stage startup. And so now basically what we're focused on is growing revenue and the team, and just overall just really enjoying the ride and really enjoying working with each other, as well as trying to build a real sustainable company that helps people solve problems. I think I will say our engineering focus really partitions into 3 distinct parts. And really you can divide our engineering project either into like the functions of what they do or the sort of use cases that they serve. So I'll talk a little bit about what that really means in practice, and we can dive into like an example project on each, and then happy to open up for Q&A. So there are really 3 components of what we do functionally. One is on the back end. And so this relates to like our API, our infrastructure, hosting on Google Cloud Platform, thinking about whether we use Kubernetes or sort of a serverless architecture, using things like Flask. Like most of our backend is built in Python, so we use various web frameworks like Flask or Fast API in order that we can receive the transactions. So via things like just post requests and various other sort of forms of HTTP verbs, and that's the primary way that we interact with our customers. There's a machine learning component. So once we receive all these transactions into our system, essentially how much value can you extract from these transactions? And so machine learning can be as simple as a rules-based system. So you think about like, oh, if you see this transaction come in, then it must be, travel. Like whenever you see Airbnb come in as a transaction, let's always call it travel because that's always what it's going to be. All the way to very advanced sort of machine learning things where you're using natural language processing and various frameworks that are available from sort of open source, things that have been trained on like Wikipedia or, the overall like web in terms of the number of websites, in terms of understanding language, to understand like what these transactions contain. And then finally, our last component is really around front end. So really thinking about things like how do we enable customers to understand our system, because these things can be quite complex. And so how do you give folks a good intuitive understanding of what is our API and what is our backend system? How do you enable them to interact with it in an easy way? Even if people are technical, it oftentimes helps to have a visual interface to see what is going on. And we found really good traction with the front end efforts that we've done with our customers. So maybe I'll stop there and leave it open for questions. I think more than happy to sort of talk really openly and honestly about any of the projects we do, or like my personal journey and various other things, ranging from sort of transitioning from consulting into data science into engineering, to sort of what it's like to start a company, and raising funds, to what it's like working at like a big tech company like Facebook or Spotify or Revolut. So happy to offer perspective on sort of a variety of topics.
Yeah, awesome. I don't know, well, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of awesome, interesting description about the company. I'm going to let people take their time to write their questions in the Q&A. I think they're going to be populating that. In the meantime, does anyone have any immediate questions about what Dom was mentioning in the introduction?
Can I ask a question about the product? Like,
sure.
Heron itself? Yeah, I've never worked FinTech. But if I'm not wrong, credit card, when you charge a transaction to credit card, there's a code for categories, right? Fairly detailed code for categories: government, retail, F&B, finance. How much more granularity does Heron really break that down into? And I mean, again, I've never actually been on the receiving end of that kind of data, so I don't know how accurate it is, how useful it is. But yeah, how much more granularity do you need before you tell the user, hey, this is gambling specifically?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question for us because just to give perspective on sort of credit card data, is that there's this thing you get back called an MCC code whenever you spend using a credit card. And so this will have some sort of category, and Visa and MasterCard are typical sort of credit card networks, and they provide this out of the box. Where we find particular resonance for our product is for use cases where that MCC code is not really sufficient. So for example, there are like banks that will lend to businesses. And if you see something like, I'm just trying to think of a good example. The kind of categories that you want to know about a business is very different than the categories you'd want to know about an individual potentially. So for example, when you look at bank data, you would want to know like what is revenue and what is like equity and what is debt that is being put into the company. And so those are the kind of categorization that we offer that is outside the scope of the default categories that you would get from something like a MCC code. But I think the larger point here is that the way we think about building product in general is really around customer problems and their use cases rather than in technical enablement, because there's low utility to us just offering like categorization as a solution, but rather like if a customer has a specific problem, we offer the solution. We understand that problem and offer the solution to that problem.
Nice. Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Did anyone else have any questions about initial questions about Dom's introduction about the company? All right, I'm going to jump into the Q&A. Joseph, I noticed your camera's off. Feel free to on your camera whenever you're ready. Okay, Dom, I don't know if you can also have the Q&A up. It's in the Zoom chat, but I'm going to be moderating based on those questions there. Okay, some really high uploaded question right here from Justin. When building an early stage startup, is it always more desirable to hire generalists? Are these generalists full stack engineers?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And I would say there's a little bit of context baked into that question. And so what I mean is when building an early stage startup, is it always more desirable to hire? Like that first assumption presupposes that you're at a stage where you're supposed to be hiring. And what I mean by that is that as a founding, typically what you want to do as a team of founders is to have all the skills you need between your founding team to find product market fit. And so let's like unpack that even a little bit more, right? Like when you're starting out, you have ideas and the people who are enough to join in the journey to like forego salary and build a company. Can you guys hear me? I think I might have just frozen.
I think we lost the last sentence. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So sorry. Just I think what I was saying was that like when you're building an early stage company, all you have are the people who are crazy enough to do it with you, and the skills that you guys possess between your team. Right? And so the idea is that unless someone is willing to give you money to start this company based on nothing, you're either you yourself or the people you do have like all the skills necessary to reach a point where you can validate whether there's something in the idea, whether you can get a few customers or launch a product or basically get an MVP out the door. And so what at least Y Combinator typically recommends is that you do that with only your team. That you shouldn't be hiring people before you validated whether you're product market fit and before you're able to launch a product at the door. And it's only after you've launched something as like a team and you see, okay, there's some customers, we're getting some traction, we're doing some growth, that it then makes sense to hire somebody. And typically, yeah, I think as the nature of a startup, you always want to be hiring generalists. So folks who can code, folks who can think on their feet, and folks who are not afraid of trying on new things. I think it seems like Rocket Academy, because everyone's coming from diverse backgrounds, you'll naturally have people who are cross-functional thinkers. But I think one way to illustrate how important this is that at Heron, for our engineers, we don't phrase projects as technical outcomes. We phrase them as business outcomes. And so what that means is that what we're asking people to do is it won't be something like, hey, stand up this, API in this like Kubernetes deployment and like make it work. It'll be, hey, like, we have to find product market fit in this particular use case and, help retain our existing customers or figure out how to find like new customers. And certainly there'll be a technical component to that, right? Like if we want new customers, we got to stand up a marketing site and have a good trial experience for developers. Or if we want to retain existing customers, we have to go and like understand what their needs are and like talk to them and then like build the things that are most requested or they're going to have the highest impact. And so for those kinds of projects, it's always, in my opinion, I think generalists or specifically people who can think about business outcomes and decompose that into technical outcomes are always more valuable than people that can only execute on technical outcomes.
Agreed,
and then I guess the final component of that is that like, are these generalists full stack engineers? I think we have a belief that if you are sort of curious enough and good enough or have a baseline level of engineering, plus are willing to always be learning and take on new skills, that actually you can start off not necessarily being full stack, but flex into like being more full stack by like learning new technologies and unblocking yourself, asking people how to do things. So for example, if you're working primarily in the back end and you want to get more into the front end, like there's always a process by which you can use to learn and develop new skills. And so we're always trying to push folks out of their like comfort zone and like flex into sort of tangential things, which may be either highly related or, you know, slightly related to their skill set. So for example, like our machine learning engineer, when he came in, was less comfortable with like backend and infrastructure, but actually it's quite important for him to develop these skills. So we really sort of pushed him towards that, and it just makes him a lot faster as an engineer as a whole.
Awesome. Wow. Justin, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a great answer. It gave some really good insights about startups and how, functions, especially for like YC. What they recommend is that you shouldn't be hiring until you know that your product is serviceable.
Yeah. I think the YC advice is pretty consistent, but also somewhat like radical relative to like general advice, because what YC will say is like, hey, do whatever is necessary to find product market fit. And until you find product market fit, like nothing else matters. And you basically want to minimize how much money you're spending until you find product market fit. And so, which then kind of beckons the question of like, what is product market fit? And like, how do you know you've found it? And there are a couple of good talks online on, what is product market fit. But the one, naturally being a YC company, the one sort of we subscribe to is this talk by Michael Siebel on finding product market fit, which I can send to Kai afterwards if anyone's curious.
That'd be great. Yeah.
But it is basically this idea that people are using your product in unexpected and destructive ways profitably. And what that means is that the market, whatever product you've made, the market is kind of ripping out of your hands, and like people are signing up from places you've never heard of, and your servers are all sort of maxing out, and you can't add capacity fast enough, and money's piling in the bank, and you can't hire customer service and sales fast enough to support the demand. And so there's a sense of like, when you're initially starting a company, it feels very much like you're pushing a boulder up a hill, because it's like every single dollar or customer is like really hard, and it feels like a victory, and it's great, but it's also kind of miserable. And that's what people call the suck. It's like when you're pre-product market fit and you're pushing this boulder up a hill. And then, what people say is that there comes a moment where that inflection changes, and suddenly the boulder starts to run away from you. And that's when you get featured in press articles, and TechCrunch picks you up, and you have investors banging on your door and all this stuff. And that's so yeah, like for Heron Data, I would say we make sort of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, which is fine for an early stage startup, but even at that stage, it's not, we wouldn't say we have product market fit until the moment where it feels like the boulder is sort of sliding away from you. And it's purposely like an experiential description rather than a technical description, because there's a lot about like, how does it feel to sort of sell the product and convince new customers to join and so on.
Yeah, I really like that engineers should also have this product thinking or business thinking at early stage startups.
I think it's especially critical because it's easy to sort of a pattern I've seen at larger tech companies is that engineers are the folks who are told what to do. And you sort of have a product manager and maybe like a data scientist or some user researcher that's like, oh, based on like XYZ, like this is what we're doing. And I don't think that makes for a very gratifying experience, because I believe that we as humans are not like, we don't want to just be told what to do. We want to like participate in what we're doing. And I think the second thing is like, oftentimes, especially in large tech companies, like those folks can like not come to the right conclusion or solution. And because oftentimes the people who are figuring out what to build have never built things themselves. Or like they've never been in like code and they've never shipped stuff. And it's very hard for them to be like, oh, this makes sense. It's like being a football coach without having ever played football before. So I think for companies really benefit when engineers, all the people who are actually building things are the ones that are also participating in the discussion of what to build.
Absolutely. I'm seeing a lot of nods. I think that's resonating with everyone. Okay, related to that kind of product thinking or business thinking software engineer, what's your strategy for hiring software engineer? How do you evaluate whether someone fits this bill?
Yeah, I think when you say strategy, I assume you mean like once we've found a candidate, how do we evaluate?
Yeah, or even before you find. Yeah, how do you even get them in this?
Yeah. Right now we haven't hired. We're a team of 5, so we don't have a very sophisticated sourcing strategy in the sense of like how to find good talent. But a lot of sort of early stage hiring, I think, comes from connections. And so like friends of friends or like various networks and so on. So maybe I won't talk too much about the sourcing side, but in terms of the evaluation side, the way we've done hiring, both for our existing roles, but also our new roles that we're hiring for, is really in 3 components of what we're looking for. One is the take-home task. And so this is just like an opportunity for people to sort of take a project, and it will resemble pretty closely what, responsibility or an example project would be like at Heron. And then it would be time boxed and just to see, how far somebody can get within a certain period of time. And that's a lot to do with like coding productivity, right? Because I think we as a company want to move fast. And so therefore, we would hope that whoever we hire would be able to sort of tackle a problem quickly, efficiently, and come to a reasonable conclusion in a relatively short period of time. Our second round of interviews are more focused on technical. So really around, so how do you break down problems? How do you take an ambiguously stated problem? How do you break it down? How do you then use code or various other things to solve that problem? Can you think in a structured way? Can you sort of, not be afraid of turning big problems into solvable smaller chunks and actually solve them with sort of engineering know-how. And then the final round of interviews is really around sort of personal traits and qualities, because I think working in an early stage startup environment necessitates this sort of self-starter mentality, right? Like if you're somebody who really enjoys like well-defined structure and everything to be like in place in terms of both the technical infrastructure, but also like career progression infrastructure and predictability and like where the company will be in 3 years, and like startups are really not the right thing for you. But if you're somebody who enjoys that kind of environment where, one day you can be the like backend engineer and the next day you could be figuring out how to drive, new leads to the website. And the next day you might be like messaging every single machine learning engineer in Singapore to find like the next best machine learning engineer for the company. And that kind of diversity of experience appeals to you, then that's the kind of thing we would also be looking for. And I think nothing I've said would really be specific to Heron. I think all like early stage startups would sort of value these kind of traits.
Does anyone have any follow-up questions on that particular one? I thought that was a pretty deep.
Am I asking too many questions?
No, you're not.
Dom, about the take-home assignment, if a bootcamp grad would get a take-home assignment that's time boxed, should they aim to do as much as possible in time given to them, or should they aim to get the MVP done within as quickly as possible and then say, hey, look, this is how efficient I can work?
Yeah, I would say the way to approach it is the way you would want to approach it at work. And what I mean by that is, there's a sort of like engineering perfection versus like getting an MVP out the door. And having a working solution is always better than having like a perfect solution. And so if you can get to I think the easiest one to talk about maybe is like our machine learning like take home tasks. Because for machine learning engineers, you can imagine that we give this take home task where we're like, build a machine learning model. Or here's a data set, build a machine learning model that does like X, whatever X may be. And I think the temptation there is to always like show like the fanciest machine learning model, and it's like this really powerful thing, but people run out of time, it doesn't work and all that stuff. When actually like really great answers include sort of starting with super basic like heuristics and like keywords and various like rules-based system, just to like get an intuition for the problem, and then like start to layer on top like more and more complexity as the problem necessitates. Because if you can actually solve the issue with just the simple heuristics layer without advanced machine learning, like just do that.
Dinesh, does that answer your question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks.
Any other follow-up questions on hiring? Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so next area, what have been some of your biggest challenges building Heron's product so far? And this is a bit ambiguous, right? Technical or product, could be either.
Yeah. I'll give one technical, one non-technical. So maybe the non-technical one, we were not always Heron Data, and we did not always sort of work with bank data. And what I mean by that is that, so imagine it was like 3 co-founders, including myself, were in Y Combinator, and actually the company name is called Open Credit. And our what we do is we try to help people find better loans based on their bank data. Which could, if you hear that, you could or could not think it's a reasonable idea. But we certainly thought it was a pretty good idea. We had gotten into Y Combinator with it. And we had launched in the middle of Y Combinator, and we were really excited. And we basically made $0 for about 2 weeks. And we're thinking to ourselves, no, like, what's going on, and like what do we do? And it was a pretty intense period of 2 weeks where we were looking through the data, we're trying to talk to customers, seeing if anything was in there, and nothing was working. We basically kind of missed the plot. The advisors at Y Combinator were like, you guys, we had kind of warned you about this, and this is not the outcome you were expecting. And it becomes this really like emotionally difficult thing, because there are a few components. One is the sort of relationship with your founders, which is not to be underestimated. Like, I think the 3 of us had different ideas about like what we should do and where we should go. For example, like one of us proposed the idea for Heron Data as we are today, and another one was like, that is a really dumb idea, right? And so I would say like a huge challenge of this is like, how do you, as like a team of people, like work together and resolve differences and figure out like a chart path forward when things get really tough, right? And so there are some like really emotionally difficult conversations in that. I would say one thing that worked really well for us is that if you're working either in a team or in a founding team, we take out an hour on Friday to do what we call level 3 conversations, which sounds a bit cliche, but it's basically like we'll talk about anything. So like what's going on at home, what's going on at work, what's going on with like relationships or family and so on. And that allows us to establish a level of trust with each other where we can just talk openly about things, right? Because a lot of times if there are disagreements at work, there are always going to be like underlying things that people are like bring with them from home, or like little microaggressions at work. And so that really helped us get through this sort of like soft challenge. But then there was like the hard challenge of like, we're supposed to be presenting at Y Combinator demo day 2 weeks later. Hundreds of investors from around the world are going to watch us present like nothing. And so the challenge for us is like, how do we get our stuff together in time to be able to like present something reasonable to investors? And I think at that stage, then it was just all about like hustle and like being super scrappy. And so what we ended up doing was just like I wouldn't say spamming, but essentially spamming like all of Y Combinator with like 3 different ideas. One, there's another idea, which is like, if you want to be a better manager, like we have a solution for you. Or in this case is like, we categorize bank data, and like, tell us if you work with bank data. And the thing that came back with the strongest pull from the market was this bank categorization idea. So, sort of Hail Mary, we all went into it, stood up like an API and a marketing site and something like demoable in a couple of weeks. I didn't really sleep during that time. But we got through okay, raised some money and are here today. As I would say on the technical side, the hardest challenge has been around elements of scalability. So I mean, specifically around like certain, specifically, I think the thought that like scale makes everything hard, which is something they teach you when you start Facebook, as Kai knows. And like carrying a jug of water from point A to point B is very different than carrying like a whole reservoir's worth of water from point A to point B. And so one thing that we've really learned along the way is that scaling things like infrastructure and machine learning models and various other things to be able to serve customers at the latency we need. Those challenges are really hard, but also those challenges are the ones that I think make you a really good engineer, because you have to consider things and you have to do things in a way that you've never thought about before. So I think as an engineer, it's been a privilege to be able to like build things first at like a smaller scale and then be able to like rip those solutions out and continue to like improve solutions or refactor solutions as you scale.
Wow. Does anyone have any follow-up questions on that? The challenges both from the company side and the scaling side? Justice? No?
I guess, not sure if this is really answered, but like which is harder, the idea stage or the execution stage?
Ooh.
Yeah, we grapple with this every day. And the way we phrase it is like, how is it harder to figure out what to build or to build it, right? There's just another way to say it. And I would say it's like infinitely harder to figure out what to build than to build something. I think knowing how to build things makes you better at figuring out what to build, because you know what is like possible or not possible, and you're able to like try out ideas very quickly. Figuring out what to build is like really, really, really hard. I would say we generally try to figure out what to build primarily by talking to customers, and by analyzing our data and seeing like what things are saying. But figuring out initially what to build is very difficult, because you kind of have to like either through personal experience or like a concerted effort to do research, or sort of by luck, like chancing across the idea, sort of figure out what to build. But then afterwards, this process of like figuring out what to build and then like building it as quickly as possible and like shipping an MVP that could like represents faithfully the like idea of what you're building, is really important, because oftentimes like the idea that you initially think is like really great turns out not to be like the idea, but in the process of trying to achieve that idea, you discover like other ideas, which is very much what happened with us. And I think it's important not to be too tied to like ideas, but really tied to like who your customers are and like what are their quote unquote hair on fire problems, right? Because if you have a class of customers and you know that they have like issues, then like what form the solution will ultimately take, you can be flexible, but you always know like, I'm just trying to solve like for this market and like this problem, this is what I'm like trying to do.
Does that answer your question, Justice?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Nice. Okay. Related question from Brian, and I know you've addressed this a little bit, Dom. Brian's question is, can you share a glimpse of the developmental journey that the core idea that Heron Data is built on took? How was it conceived? So we mentioned a little bit of that, refined till its birth and sustained in its current growth. So maybe, you talked a bit about the lead up to demo day, but maybe we can talk about a bit more about that lead up to demo day, as well as the journey post demo day, How has it gotten to where it is today?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question for us because in the lead up to demo day, we had had this idea let's categorize bank transactions, and people sign up on that basis, and we kind of ran with it. But we experienced a few months where we didn't really grow that much, and customers were not really signing on and all this things. And I think in retrospect, what we did wrong was we focused very much on the solution and not on the customer and their problems. And so what I mean by that is we kind of had this nice idea let's categorize bank transaction data, and bank transaction data categorization is inherently useful, right? Because who doesn't want bank data that you can't use? But it wasn't until we really focused on okay, who actually has bank transaction data and why are they using us, that it kind of led to the current growth and that we're on today. And so we use sort of it's like the hammer finding the nail analogy, right? Once you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and you just want to hammer all these nails. But the reality is that all these nails are slightly different size and shapes, and they're all into different materials and blah blah blah. And the key thing for us was we use this sort of opportunity to find a few customers that were really that really enjoyed using us, and we sort of went and spoke with them and really understood why they use us. And so it turns out that there are this sort of two use cases that I think I briefly alluded to before. One is really around lending. And so when someone applies for a loan, you can, people typically take some bank transaction data and analyze it to understand, what is this company's revenue? And does the person gamble and various other things. And then the second use case was really around, using us to make the user experience better, either by offering better sort of offering logos and clean descriptions and various other things, as well as enabling other features. And so it wasn't until actually we narrowed down to those two use cases, and we said okay, here are two use cases. Here are the types of customers associated with these two use cases, and here are their problems. What do they complain to us about? And actually, it turns out that even within something as niche as categorizing bank transaction data, once you split into two use cases and you really understand the customer problem, what it makes sense to build next is actually quite different, which also makes things challenging for us because we have two separate use cases and very good logos on both. But now the roadmap for the both is different, right? Because for lenders, they really want a nice to use user interface, and they can see a company's financials and as they apply and various other things. And then for enrichment, it's all about what extra features can you give to these banks that are offering these kinds of features. And so right now, I would say we're sort of at these two use cases, executing on both of these things in parallel, but then ignoring everything else that our product is being used for. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers if that answers the question, but
Brian, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing also is that there's always this fine balance or this tension between the product that you want to build versus the customer. And it goes back down to what you said earlier about product market fit, right? And actually a follow-up question to that is also then, and from the perspective of bootcamp students, would you say that it's also a very good skill to cultivate the ability to really talk about our code or our product and be able to translate that from the engineering language, or you mentioned heuristics, machine learning, and it's so complex, it's so intricate, and to be able to sell it to someone who has zero knowledge of what it is that we're doing and convince them that, hey, this is what you need.
Yeah. It's super fascinating, right? Because you have to unlearn some things you learn in school. And in school, in math class, if you get the answer, if you're solving a math problem, you have to show all your work and show all the bones. And then your solution is like part of the grade, but like, it matters like what's on the inside. I think the reality of like building a product in the market is like no one cares what's on the inside, and people only care about the outcome, which is great because then you don't have to like worry about all the like stuff that you had to do just like show marks in school. I think the best example of this is there's a talk. Have you guys heard of the company Segment? They were acquired by Twilio, the like SMS company. So there are a bunch of like these B2B products in the world, right? Like Segment is one of them that are actually like super useful, especially if you're a startup. Segment is like an analytics company where you can pipe data from your website into like their servers, and it does things like track page views and events and things like that. They were recently bought, I think, it's either 2 billion or 8 billion, but it's definitely like some form of like billions for dollars. Like maybe this was like last year or the year before. And the CEO and founder, one of the co-founders, Peter Reinhardt, gives a talk that was a Stanford lecture on finding product market fit. And it was like these 4 guys, MIT, like stereotypical coding nerds. And I think they crunched maybe like tens and thousands of lines of code over like 5 years and never found product market fit. And what happened was, as like they were basically out of money. They had like a month or 2 left of like runway. And one of the engineers was like, hey, like we, for one of our ideas, we wrote this little like package called analytics.js, which, some folks have said like, that's the thing that's useful and that's what I want. I know, he was like, I know it's only 150 lines of code relative to our like tens and thousands of lines of code. But what if we like open source that and like made that available? And apparently the guy was like, no, that's really stupid. It's 150 lines of code. Like who's ever going to pay for this? Like, this is dumb. But lo and behold, he's like, okay, we'll like put together a marketing page. We'll like advertise it. We'll spit it out and we'll see what the market says. So lo and behold, as you might guess, 150 lines of code with a marketing page. They launch it, goes to the top of Hacker News, like thousands of stars on their GitHub repo. They raise like a gangbuster, round of money from investors, and today they're like billions of dollars worth of company. And that started from this kernel of like the 150 lines of code that is analytics.js. So yeah, I would say definitely no need to like show your work and talk about like technical concepts unless it's like actually relevant to the market that you're serving.
Well, it's a really deep story. All right. I want to move on a little bit. Chuan-Xin has a bit more technical questions. Chuan-Xin had a question about the different stacks that we talked about, front end, back end, and full stack. We were saying a little bit like, okay, if you start off on back end, then you still should be able to flex and grow into front end. And I'm going to try and combine Chuan-Xin's 2 questions. So the first question is, front end, full stack, back end. Seems like lines are blurred between the 3. What really differentiates the 3, and also in the context of the web? And then related to that is, Dom mentioned Next.js in Heron's tech stack. This implies server-side rendering. How much of the server in server-side rendering does a front-end developer at Heron interface with? How much back-end does the front-end need to know, and vice versa?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. And I think it talks a lot about like boundaries of roles, because I think at a traditional sort of larger tech firm, it's very clear if you're like a DevOps engineer, this is what you do. And if you're a backend engineer, that's what you do. And a front-end engineer, that's what you do. And but then I think once you're in a smaller company, for better or for worse, your like cone of exposure automatically gets larger. Like if there's one backend engineer, they probably are also doing quite a lot of like DevOps and security and infrastructure. And if there's like one front-end engineer and no designer, the kind of things that we would be looking for are folks who can flex beyond just being able to write, like React code. And so someone who can at least have a design brain and like think about design principles, or be interested in general sort of UI components, and have at least like an interest in what is the data that's coming to the front end that you have to consume. And so we're still refining this, and part of it is contingent on like what is available in the market. But our current thesis is that for something like a front end role, we think about it as like a full stack front end, in a sense that front end can be partitioned into like UI, UX, and like writing code, or like and implement on yourself, or have you really, and then maybe at a stretch, the sort of like managing GraphQL and the backend and the kind of data that you get that comes to the front end. And so sort of the more willing a person is able to like operate across that stack, I think the just easier it is for us, because then it means that the person can be independent. And I think the operating word here is independent, because you don't want to have to, you want to balance sort of people's growth and development with the ability for someone to just like take charge and like learn this stuff and unblock. So,
Chauncey, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Cool. Independence. Yeah, at Rocket Academy, we're also trying to teach people, right? Not any particular stack or language, but really the learning how to learn, so that you can pick up new skills on your own that are needed afterward.
yeah,
Frankie has a question. Oh yeah, go on.
I know. I was gonna say, I think this is this is really important, right? Because I know there are engineers that are like, oh, you know, like I am a like Elixir engineer, and like that's it. Or I am like, I only worked with like Vue or Gatsby or something. And it's just, I think it's important to be framework agnostic, and really understand like what is the job that needs to be done, and be able to like then backward induce to what are the skills and frameworks you need to sort of level up on in order to accomplish that.
Awesome. Frankie's question: what is the process of protecting your customers' data like? What is the auditing process like, though? What kind of contingencies do you have in place?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And I think the meta thing about security and sort of data privacy is it's not a problem until it is a problem, and then it's a very serious like company sinking problem. So it's the kind of thing where like it's easy to justify not doing it, but you definitely need to do it. Otherwise, like, you know, you can be working for 4 years and everything's great, and suddenly a data breach happens and you're totally hosed. So this is something we think a lot about. And the main thing here is that the other point here is that you don't need to like reinvent the wheel, because oftentimes there are a lot of standards that are out there that are readily available that people can use, right? And so for this sort of stuff like data privacy and security, there are known sort of certification bodies that you can use. So it's like SOC 2 is a type of certification, and there are various vendors that help you achieve SOC 2, and they'll have a checklist of like, oh, here are like all the things you need to be SOC 2 compliant. And so I think another one's called like PCI, which is a little bit more stringent. And so there'll be like an additional list of things you need to do to be PCI compliant. But the short of it for startups is that as a founder, you'll have to balance when you get these kind of certifications versus, you know, you don't want to get a certification for like an idea that's not going to have legs. So there is this like delicate balance of like having enough customers and traction to know this is like a thing worth getting SOC 2 compliant for, versus like then actually biting the bullet and doing SOC 2 compliance. So we actually just started doing SOC 2 compliance, but that came after, you know, like a few dozens of customers and like knowing that actually like this is worth doing.
Frankie, does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm asking about the auditing process because I think I have some knowledge about this, because some auditors will come in and then they're not particularly thorough. So just because you're certified doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean like, you know, you're sort of like you don't have vulnerabilities, so to speak, in a sense. Yeah. So I'm just
definitely like I think that question also speaks to like doing what is right by your customer and doing like what is kind of necessary to get the like checkbox on like a thing. And ultimately, if I think for any startup, hopefully you'll have a set of customers, and for your set of customers, you want to like make them happy, right? And like a lot of times our job is like whatever it takes to make those customers happy and to find like more customers like those customers. And so I think security is an interesting one because it's one where like past the minimum point, like people are generally okay with security, but that doesn't mean that it's like in overall terms okay if we know it not to be okay. But then it's just this really delicate balance of like, how much you invest in creating a world-class security system versus how much do you like build features that will like improve traction and like drive customer growth and drive customer retention. So I think it's a controversial answer slightly because in the context of like big companies, like for example, for Spotify, it's like no brainer. Of course you want like security, but the reality of a startup oftentimes is that like you are just trying to sort of survive and make money and like know that this is like the right thing to do. So you kind of always have to be making these trade-offs of like, what is the perfect like security solution that's going to take us, like 8 months to build versus like, what is the minimum level of like security we need to like know for our customers to know and for us to know that it's safe. And then like, what is the delta there and how much do we flex into that?
Jeff, do you have a question? I saw you raise your hand.
No, it's not a question. I was actually just going to add to what Dom was saying, just from my experience. So for context, like for those people who don't know me other than an athlete, I was an engineer as well. And at BCG Digital Ventures, I used to help build companies for clients. And we would get to the product to a certain stage where, much like you want to launch at the right time, you also want to be sure that when you're launching that you don't have any like glaring security issues. And so Frankie, as per your question, like what does the auditing process look like in practice? Yes, everything what Dom said, but what we used to do was we used to hire people to hack us, to try at least. And then essentially that gives you a bunch of, well, hopefully it doesn't raise much more tech debt for you. Are you all familiar with the term tech debt?
I think a lot of us may not be.
So
Sorry,
tech
what?
debt.
Technical debt.
Technical debt. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but essentially what it is like Dom will be building stuff at Heron Data. They'll notice things like, a customer has said that this button on the website doesn't work, but this button is not necessarily crucial to solving the customer's problem. And so whilst it isn't great that it doesn't work, it will be put on a list called the technical debt list, which will be then reprioritized later when it's time to actually address those things. And the key thing with technical debt is that you build it up over a bunch of time, but when you need to build new features in the future, you don't want it to be so big and so limiting that in order to like build a new feature, you need, it takes you weeks to solve an issue in order to move forward properly and efficiently. So it's a game about like managing your priorities, but the short answer to your question is that you'd hire someone to hack you and you'd figure out what your vulnerabilities are, and then you'd see whether those are like actually show-stopping or not.
Awesome. I want to be mindful of time because we're coming up to the hour, so maybe we can wrap up a bit. I know there are a few other questions. So I'm gonna, Bunmi, I know you had a question, and Amit, I saw you had a question, and maybe I'll follow up with Dom afterward and see if Dom can help answer those asynchronously. Maybe just to wrap up, Dom, yeah, so thanks so much for being here with us. Jeff as well, thanks so much for being here with us. Dom, maybe just to wrap up, would you have any final advice for all of our students here who are career switchers, super awesome people making their way into tech?
I think no like silver nugget of wisdom other than, the skill sets you guys are building is super dangerous. And what I mean by dangerous is that like, you can create a company or you can go work at like a awesome like tech company or like revolutionize the digital transformation of like a non-tech company. And I think my journey, we didn't talk about this too much, but my journey into software engineering actually began like a year and a half ago. And so I think with enough sort of drive and enthusiasm and stuff, it's surprising how much you can do in like what little period of time. And you guys have a great teacher in Kai to like lead you guys. So, like good luck, and very excited to see how everyone goes.
All right. I'm seeing a lot of nods. I'm seeing a lot of resonance with what you're saying. Thanks so much, Dom, for being with us today.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for the wisdom. And I'll follow up with some questions. Hope to share, I think, some resources. Dom, you mentioned a lecture or a talk or something. Michael Siebel's.
Yeah.
And I'll forward the remaining questions as well.
All right. Sounds good.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Dom.
Thanks, Dom. Thanks,
guys.
Jeff. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dom.